So now I'm going to be talking about the post-independence situation within Colombia. And what's important to know before I say anything is that Colombia was known as New Granada at the time, and it was basically run by liberals. So liberals in New Granada dominated both the presidency and the Congress. In 1853, the new constitution gave suffrage to all males, which troubled a lot of the liberals since they believed that illiterate peasants would start to vote for conservative policies, but this didn't happen, and most people just ended up voting in the interests of their bosses, the local landowners. So the liberals stayed in power until around the 1870s. So during this liberal era in New Granada, they sought to end the colonial tradition of restriction and monopoly. So they abolished the state tobacco monopoly in 1850, and they stopped taking the tithe money from the church. They stopped taxing gold and other precious metals, and they replaced this with individual taxes instead. Another goal of the liberals in New Granada was to stop slavery. So in 1851, slavery was completely abolished. And the liberals of this time equated emancipation with the creation of one culture. And that kind of required the elimination of African and indigenous ethnic identities. And basically, they wanted to invent a unified national Hispanic culture instead of having all three is just one. So this basically led to indigenous and African communal lands who had their own autonomous political traditions, basically to be seized and passed into the hands of neighboring haciendas. So many of these indigenous people became workers for the haciendas, and vagrancy laws similarly coerced the labor of so-called free blacks. So, in 1860, the liberals carried their religious and political reforms to their logical conclusions, which meant that the clergy privileges were abolished, as well as compulsory tithes, and churches and monasteries were closed, and all that land was sold to private owners for the profit of the state. So, liberal political reform reached its climax in 1863 as a new constitution carried federalism to great lengths. Each province in New Granada acted as an independent nation, each having their own military, possessing all the legislative powers not explicitly granted to the central government, which was made as weak as possible. In the 1870s, coffee became the country's main export, and in the provinces of Santander and Cundinamarca, the production of coffee relied on old school haciendas where workers faced a lot of oppression. On the other hand, in provinces like Antioquia and Caldas, the coffee industry boomed as more enlightened forms of sharecropping and small holdings allowed for higher productivity rates in the coffee farms. So, the development of the coffee industry and growing ties with domestic merchants and the stimulus of the economy by the expropriation of church lands created economic interests that required a new political model. So, the liberal reform removed many obstacles to capitalist development but created its others in its feudal excesses. So, Colombia entered a new wave of politics. And basically elected conservative Rafael Nunez as president in 1879, and his era is known as the regeneration of Colombia. And so during this regeneration, he replaced all the sovereign states with departments headed by governors which were elected by the president. He believed that the church was the foundation of social order and made Catholicism the official religion, and entrusted education to the clergy. He also created a strong standing army and national police force. He was credited with two economic innovations: tariff protection to stimulate the growth of domestic industries, and a national bank, which represented an initial effort to create a national system of credit. Even though his bank was later mismanaged, it still was like a first step in that direction. He also gave the impulse to construction of internal improvements, especially railroads, which really set Colombia up to be a growing capitalist country in Latin America.